Hi, my name is William Ury, and it's a real pleasure to be able to be with you this morning and to follow these very distinguished speakers. And what I want to talk to you about is a question that I've had probably ever since I was young, which was, how are we human beings going to live with each other, with our deepest differences? How are we going to actually harness our differences to make for a better world for everyone? And that's the question I asked myself when I was young and when I was your age. And it's something I've followed ever since. By training, I'm an anthropologist. I studied anthropology to study that question. By profession, I'm a mediator, which means I work at helping people deal with their conflicts. And I've worked in a whole variety of situations, from family feuds to labor strikes to political strife to civil wars, the Cold War. And I've spent about 35 years doing that. And I still have that question. And to me, this is the question that faces our generation, which is, we now have weapons that are incredibly destructive. And there's a race going on right now. Are we going to actually invent better ways of dealing with each other and dealing with our differences and living with our differences? Or are we going to perish? And to me, that's the challenge that faces us right now at this moment in our human evolution. And so I'd like to begin this talk, actually, which is about American politics, by going back, rewinding the history tape about 218 years, and remembering a letter that was written by an old man. And in this letter, this man called himself, he said, think of me as an old and friendly, an old friend, really, an old friend who's sharing some thoughts with you. And this was a man who had served his country courageously for about 45 years. And he was thinking of the future. He was thinking of us today, actually. He was speaking to us today. And what he said was, the message he wanted to leave us was, he said, that is, and I'll use his words, actually. He said, it is of infinite moment. In other words, nothing could be more important, that you should properly estimate the immense value of your national union, of our unity as human beings, our unity as citizens of this republic, to the immense value of your national union, to your collective and individual happiness. That's the message he wanted to leave us, was that there was nothing more important than our unity. And then he went on to warn us of what he called the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which he called a frightful despotism. And what he said was, it serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. He said, it agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, playing just to fear, basically. And it kindles the animosity of one part against another. Does that sound familiar, 218 years later? And what he ended his letter by expressing the hope that his words might be productive of some partial benefit, some occasional good, that they may now and then recur to moderate the fury of party spirit. And as you may have guessed, that man who called himself an old and affectionate friend was none other than George Washington. At the very end of his presidency, the first presidency of this country, that was his basic message to us. And so my hope is that we can reach back to that wisdom. Let his words, that wisdom, come into the present moment and see if we can temper the fury of party spirit. And to me, what I'd like to do then now is, for a moment, is roll the tape of history about 200 years to 1999, when I was privileged and invited by Mark Gerzon, our friend here, to participate as a facilitator in a bipartisan congressional retreat that was held in Hershey, Pennsylvania, place of Hershey candies. And There were about 200 members of Congress and their families who came up by train from Washington, D.C. And the very first evening, Mark had asked us to divide up the groups, and so each of us facilitators had about 4 members of Congress who were Republican, 4 members of Congress who were Democrat, and often their families were there, and we were sitting around in this kind of circle, and the idea was to kind of break the ice. And it was interesting to me, on that train coming up from DC, one member of Congress remarked to me, because Congress had just then gone through a very bitter episode of the impeachment process of President Bill Clinton. And one member of Congress said to me, "You know, Bill," he said, "in this 2-hour train ride, I've spent more time talking with members of the other party than I have in all my years of Congress, in the last 4 years at least." And you know, that was the occasion, and that unfortunately is the situation still today. Well, anyway, so I was kind of facilitating this group, and here we were, you know, 8 people, or actually more because there were some spouses and so on, and we were sitting around a circle, no podium, no table, and you know, there's a little bit of tension in the air because they hadn't really been talking, and there was some kind of like nervousness and stiffness. But the image that I always take away is that one of the members of Congress had failed to find a babysitter for her 6-month-old baby. And so she didn't know what to do with her baby, so she put the baby in the middle of the circle on the floor there. And the baby was kind of like cooing and squiggling and whatever. And while all these members of Congress, all these political leaders were in a circle. And what I watched is the effect of that baby on these members of Congress. Talk about humanizing. It basically, hostility dissolved. It was very hard to say an ill word when you have this baby in the middle of the room. And to me, I've always taken that away as a symbol, because that's essentially what's being called for, is that baby represents the future. That represents the future that George Washington was talking about. That's the future of our country. And somehow, what that baby did was she played that role of giving us perspective. What is this all about? I mean, why are we living here? Why are we working in politics if not to make a better world for that baby and the next generation? So for me, that is really one of the keys. The key challenges that we face is, how do we create that kind of perspective as we engage in politics? How do we remember what is truly important? And that baby was just a way of reminding us of what is truly important in this life. What is truly important in politics? What are we actually trying to do here? And how do we create a world in which the life for the baby, for the youth, is going to be a better world? The kind of world that George Washington, 218 years ago, was hoping, an America that is actually united. And so that brings me back to my own background, which is, as I mentioned, I started with that question when I was in college about how are we human beings going to deal with our differences? How are we going to deal with our disputes? Not to suppress the differences, but actually, how do we harness the differences and actually make them into something positive? And I had the great fortune of meeting, when I had that question, I was studying anthropology, of meeting a professor in a law school, Professor Roger Fisher. And he and I started working on a field that didn't really even have so much of a name yet, but it was the emerging field of negotiation. And we worked on it, and we taught it, and we wrote a book together. And that book was called Getting to Yes. And what was the essence of this method? The essence of the method of getting to yes is not what's often done in Washington, which is where they talk about compromise, and compromise just means it's kind of a split the difference solution between one side and the other, which leaves both sides dissatisfied often. But it's not that compromise is a bad word, although in many quarters it's considered a very bad word, to compromise your values. But what we were looking for were methods that would produce genuine solutions. And I remember there was a story kind of an emblematic story that we liked, that came from probably one of the very earliest management theorists in this country, who was a woman, actually, who lived in Boston a little more than a century ago. His name was Mary Parker Follett, and she was once in a library just like this, a university library at Harvard. She was watching two students get into a quarrel because one wanted the window open, and the other one would go and shut the window, and then the other would go and open the window, the other would go and shut the window. Finally, the librarian comes over and she asks the first student, well, why do you want the window open? He says, well, I want some fresh air. I need some fresh air. She asks the second one, why do you want the window closed? He said, well, the draft is blowing my papers around. So then she asked the question, well, how do we get you fresh air without you a draft? They talk about it for a while, and then one gets an idea, disappears into the room next door, opens a window there, thus providing fresh air for the first student without a draft for the second. Now, in that very simple solution, that very simple story, you see what's happening here is we often start, as in politics, we start with two positions. There's the Republican position, there's the Democrat position, you start with two positions, and they get into a big quarrel, they bother everyone. But the whole idea of getting to yes is to look behind those positions for what are the underlying interests? What do people really need? What are the real needs there? In one case, it was fresh air. In the other sense, it was no draft. By asking that magical question, why? And by doing that, you end up with a solution that's not just a half-open window, which is a compromise, which might be too much draft, not enough fresh air, but a creative, innovative, integrative solution, like an open window in the next room. So my question is, what does it take for our politics to be able to do that very simple process of going behind our positions, the things we say we want, the things we demand, the positions we take on various policies, try to understand the interests of both sides, of all sides, in fact, because there are many parties, and then try to tap into our innate human creativity to see if we can come up with solutions that are better for everyone. So that's the challenge. And then, if I may just go fast forward a few years beyond Hershey, a group of us, in fact, many of us, some here in the room, some of the speakers and so on, we got together and we decided, let's run a series of experiments. Let's just see if we bring people together from right and left and from different parties together. And we called them initially, they were called the Gold Lake experiments. And Gold Lake is a place not too far from where we're speaking right now, up here in the foothills and up in the mountains. And we decided to do an experiment where we'd bring together, the first one, as I recall, was we brought together 25 or 30 leaders of mass movement organizations, right, left, that were clashing with each other, attacking each other bitterly in the press and in their direct marketing campaigns, organizations like the Christian Coalition, like Common Cause, like Move On, like the American Conservative Union, like Americans for Tax Reform, people who wouldn't be caught dead being in the same room together. And somehow, through some miracle, we were able to invite them up here in Colorado, up in the mountains. And thankfully, the weather cooperated, and we got a huge snowstorm, and it socked everyone in. So even when they got in there and they saw who was in the room, they couldn't flee because there was no way to leave Gold Lake. So we were there for about 3 or 4 days, and we were in a lodge that was pretty much like this room right here. And it was even hard to go outside to get to your cabin. So everyone was basically in this lodge for the 4 days. So we were trapped like hostages, having to actually deal with each other and live with each other. And we started, that's what I call, in negotiation to be one of the great fundamentals, foundations of negotiation, is the ability to go to the balcony, to get some perspective, to keep your eyes on the prize. It's almost like you're negotiating on a stage. Part of your mind goes to a mental and emotional balcony where you can kind of see what's important. That baby, for example, in that room reminded people of what's important. What is really important here? Is it really to clash with each other, or is it to actually solve the problem and move forward? And Gold Lake was like a giant balcony. It was up in the mountains. Everyone had some perspective. And on that balcony, what did we begin to do? We began to listen to each other. We went around and asked questions like how did you get involved in politics? Why did you go into public service in the first place? People told stories, personalized, humanized, and you begin to see that's not just a cardboard figure, that's a human being, and asked people, what values, what is it you really care about? And found out, hey, there's actually more that we're concerned about. Then talk about, what are your concerns about what's happening to this country and the polarization? What are your worries for the future, for the next generation, and so on? Anyway, out of that listening, we began to kind of reframe the picture. People began to see things very differently, and I'll just give you one example that came out of that was the head of one of the heads of MoveOn, the head of the Christian Coalition, who incidentally were both women leaders. I saw them. They were off in a corner there talking with each other and talking about various issues, including women's issues and so on, but other issues as well. And then, lo and behold, just as one little tidbit, a few weeks later, they're back in Washington. There was a bill up in the Senate that was being debated. It looked like it was going to pass. It was about creating a private internet, like a second internet that was going to be private. And suddenly, when there's this congressional hearing, Senate hearing, suddenly MoveOn from the left, Christian Coalition from the right, joined together and lobby jointly against this legislation. Well, you put yourself in the shoes of a senator. When you see MoveOn and Christian Coalition together, and it's such an unlikely combination that they fled from that bill as fast as they could. So that's the power here. That is the real power, which is we need like 1,000 Gold Lakes. We need to institutionalize that kind of process happening at all levels of the society, to have those conversations where we can get on a balcony, get a little bit away from the madding scene, listen to each other, truly listen to each other, see the picture in a different way, and begin to work together. It's not to ignore our differences, but to see where we can actually solve problems together. And if I may conclude, I'd like to, because we're at University of Colorado, and I remember, some people here will remember, there was a great professor here who taught here for many, many years. His name was Kenneth Boulding. And he once said, he was a professor of economics and of peace theory, and he once said, what exists is possible. This is also, Gold Lake, those things existed. But even on a larger scale, I'm remembering now, since I'm thinking historically, this is the 50th anniversary of what I would call not just a bipartisan, but a transpartisan cooperation of immense moment to the country, which was the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Many people may not remember the history so well. Many people associate it with Lyndon Baines Johnson and so on. But the real truth is it was passed through transpartisan cooperation. It was leaders, for example, conservative leaders like Everett Dirksen, Republican from Illinois, like William McCulloch, another diehard conservative from Ohio, who approached the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration, and said, look, we can work together. Because up to then, every civil rights bill had been filibustered in the Senate. It ended, it died right there. But when people from all sides of the political spectrum were able to reach agreement, able to share credit, which is very important in Washington. There's an old saying that there's no limit to how far you can go in that city if you're willing to share the credit. And they were able to share the credit, and lo and behold, when it came to passing that bill, what was the key to passing the bill? It wasn't just the Democrats. It was the Republicans. 27 out of 33 Republican senators voted for that bill, far more proportionally than the Democrats. It was more than just kind of bipartisan compromise. It was realizing for the unity of this country, for the justice of this country, we had to right this great historic wrong. And that was the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. So I just want to leave you with, the fact that it's happened before, it can happen again. There's nothing stopping us. It just takes us going to the balcony, listening to each other, reframing, and I invite you to join us all in this grand adventure. Thank you.